All right, everybody, this is the Age of Exploration. We're going to look at the 15th and 16th centuries, which you should know by now is the 14 and the 1500s. The Age of Exploration is going to cover 9 different explorers, and we're going to see how the rest of the world basically was discovered. So far, we've basically been in Europe and in Asia and in Africa. All right, so we're going to see a little bit more of the world now expand out as these explorers go out over this 200-year period. Our first explorer is Zheng He from China, and he's going to be one of the first explorers to really sail long distances back and forth. But you'll notice that he never leaves the Western Pacific or the Indian Ocean. He sticks around pretty close to the coast wherever he goes. So he's not going out into what we call blue water sailing deep out into the ocean. Now, he made 7 voyages over a period of about 50 years, and he's not really in the Georgia standards, but he has the coolest ships I've ever seen, and I can't leave him out because you got to see these ships. So he had 62 ships. And on those 62 ships, 27,000 men on his first voyage, almost 28,000 men. So these were really big ships, and they were packed with exotic animals, with precious metals, with spices, and he went all over the Indian Ocean and down the coast of Africa, Arabia, trading all of these different goods. So this is a map that he made. In this map, this would be China right in the middle. You'd have what would be North and South Korea here today. And then over here on the left, you've got India. So they didn't really know a lot about this area. And this is a crude map compared to what we have today, but it was actually a really good map based off of his travels that he was able to make. I just noticed this. This kind of looks like a face here. I put a little red dot right here, a little red dot right here. You got a nose. He's got kind of a creepy little grin here. Anyway, this is Zheng He's treasure ship. Now, there's a couple things to notice about the ship that I think is just really, really neat. It's very big for a wooden ship. One of the problems with wooden ships is the bigger they get, the more they tend to leak because they flex. And it takes a lot of special construction techniques to make them sturdy enough to be able to be this big. Most ships have one line of sails that just go right down the middle of the ship. It's really unique. He's got sails that are parallel to each other on the ship, which I don't think I've ever seen on any other ship, a wooden sailing ship. And then the other thing is you can see he's using lateen sails here. And one of the problems with sailing back and forth across the Indian Ocean is depending on what season it was, if it was the monsoon season or not, the winds would be blowing one direction or the other, and it made it difficult to travel because half the year the winds were blowing one direction, half the year they were blowing the other direction. So a lot of times the sailors would cross the Indian Ocean, and then they would have to wait for 3 to 6 months before they could cross back over again when the wind shifted directions. And the lateen sails look like big wings, and they're essentially like airplane wings that are on their side, and they allowed a ship to travel at an angle across the wind. So when the wind was blowing straight toward them, they could kind of turn at an angle, and they would tack back and forth into the wind. So unfortunately, after these 50 years of voyages, there was a new emperor, and he wanted to isolate China. He felt like that the contact with other countries wasn't good for them, and he had all of Zheng He's ships destroyed. So our first explorer from Europe is Vasco da Gama. He was Portuguese, which is a little country right up here that sort of borders Spain in southwest Europe. And he is going to sail around the tip of Africa and up to India. Now, Constantinople fell in 1453. So it only took about 16 years or so for these European countries to start trying to find a different trade route. There were really 3 main trade routes here. You had the Silk Road, which went through Constantinople and into Asia. Constantinople was kind of up here. And then you had the Mediterranean route that went through here, except At this point, there was no canal here, no Panama Canal. So you couldn't transport a ship over the land in this area. You had to move your goods to a new ship and then put them through. And also the Italian, really powerful Italian merchants, these from Florence here in Italy, are going to also have that route kind of locked up. So there needs to be another trade route found, and Vasco da Gama is going to find that route. They stock the ship filled with supplies. He goes out sailing, and he gets pushed way off course here, and he nearly makes it to Brazil. But finally, he gets righted in the direction he's supposed to go, and he ends up just barely making it to the tip of Africa. Now, if he had been a little bit further south, who knows where he would have ended up. So he makes it to the tip of Africa, and then he finally sails around and he makes it to India. And so he's going to have a new route to trade with India, and that's going to make the Portuguese very wealthy for a little while. One of the things he does, though, is most of the ships that wanted to trade, you wouldn't fill your ship up with supplies for your sailors. You would fill them up with goods to trade with. And so you would have to stop pretty regularly and resupply your ship, or else all your people would starve to death. You could put more supplies in there so it could stop less, but then you would be taken away from your profit because you're using cargo space. So the Portuguese are actually going to take over all of these ports that are on the coast of Africa, the western coast of Africa. And by doing that, what they're going to do is they're going to deny other ships that aren't Portuguese places to pull their ships in and resupply. And so it's going to give the Portuguese a monopoly on this route. One other little thing, half of the crew died from scurvy. They made it across the Indian Ocean just fine. It only took 32 days to make this route here. But on the way back, when they tried to come back, they were sailing against the monsoon winds. They didn't have a lot of lateen cells, and they're going to take more than 130 days to make a trip that took them 32 the first time. And half of his crew is going to die of scurvy. So many of them died, they finally had to sink one of the ships because there wasn't enough people to run the ship. Scurvy is actually a vitamin C deficiency. It's not really a disease so much as it is just a lack of vitamin C, but it makes you really lightheaded, can't think clearly, you feel great fatigue, and your teeth fall out with scurvy, and you start to have vision problems. So they didn't know what vitamin C was, but they discovered that if you eat citrus, it would keep you from getting this scurvy disease. And so after they figured out that citrus would stop this from happening, they started putting citrus on the ships for the sailors. And a lot of the ships would have barrels of salted lime that the sailors could eat to keep them from getting scurvy. And that is actually going to become a big part of Latin American drink culture, is the salted lime. Our next European explorer is going to be Christopher Columbus. He was an Italian, but he sailed for Spain. So he wanted Italy to be able to have this route, but a lot of the Italians didn't care because they still had the Mediterranean route. And so he was so desperate to make a name for himself in this discovery that he's actually going to go to the Spanish and say, hey, look, if you'll give me some ships, I'm going to find a new way to get to, I can find you a new way to get to Asia. And so the Spanish don't believe that he can accomplish this, but the Spanish royalty gives him 3 little ships and just the barest amount of supplies that he would need. And he sails west. And he thinks people didn't really believe the world was flat. If you remember, if we go all the way back to like Plato and Aristotle, they did scientific experiments way back then to show that the world was round, and they even got a pretty good idea of how big it was. Christopher Columbus thought that they were wrong, that it was smaller than they said, and he thought he would be able to get to Asia pretty quickly by sailing westward. So he sails westward and he discovers not Asia, but an entirely new continent. He actually thinks he landed in an Indian island first, which is why we call Native Americans Indians, because they thought that they had found India. So he discovers the whole Western Hemisphere, North, Central, South America. He does it for the trade. And if this is going to make Spain one of the most, well, for a time, the most powerful country in the world, and also one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It makes Spain so wealthy that it's actually going to cause an economic collapse because it destroys the price of gold and silver. So here's a couple of blanks for you. They did it for the trade. So the fall of what in 1453 choked overland trade? The fall of Constantinople. All right. Choked overland trade, and who had control of the African oceanic route? The Portuguese. So Portugal had control of the African oceanic route. You may have learned about Christopher Columbus in school. There was a little rhyme that I think pretty much every kid learned when I was a kid anyway. It was in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. All right, the Columbian Exchange. Now, this is a really interesting part of world history to me because finding the New World was almost like finding another planet. It was an area that had really developed in isolation from the rest of the world, didn't have European diseases, it didn't have really, most of the people there lived in fairly primitive conditions. And by accounts, the whole entire continent, especially North America, just teemed with wildlife. There were fish schools that were so thick with cod that ships actually couldn't sail through them because there were so many fish. And the land just there was like geese, fish, there were deer, bear. You take a place like California at one time had they estimate 650,000 grizzly bears in California, and there's zero now. So I think if we could go back in time and look at North America and South America at the time of European discovery, we would be shocked at how much more wildlife was actually there than there is now. All right, so how long have horses been in North America? Here's an interesting question, a little trivia question for you. How long have horses been in North America? Well, you may be surprised to find that the Spanish are the ones that brought horses over. And by the time of the like spaghetti western cowboy movies where cowboys and Indians are riding around on horses and shooting at each other, the Native Americans, some of those Native Americans um, had horses for more than 200 years, and they'd integrated those horses into their culture. So a lot of those cultures changed dramatically with the introduction of horses. There's a lot of other things that weren't in North America that Europeans brought over, and vice versa. A lot of things in North America that Europeans didn't have. And it's going to have a big impact on both hemispheres. So, potatoes is maybe arguably one of the biggest ones. The potatoes in the Americas are brought back to Europe. So, when it says here, from Americas, that's implying to Europe. So, this is stuff that comes to Europe from America. So the Americas are going to send Europe potatoes, and it's going to cause a population boom in Europe because potatoes are a really high calorie food. If you're bored during this break, unexpected break, watch the movie The Martian. Uh, the guy survives on Mars after he accidentally gets abandoned there, and he does it by farming potatoes. So potatoes are a high calorie source of food. And the great thing about potatoes is a lot of times you could leave them in the ground for a long time. And that way, if you harvest them all at one time, it was very easy for somebody to come along and just steal your crop. But if you left them in the ground and only pulled them out when you needed them, then they were a lot harder for somebody to come through and steal. So you're going to see a big population boom happen in Europe because of the introduction of potatoes. Corn is going to do the same thing. Maize, the smaller version of corn, that eventually is modified into what we have today. That's going to come, and it's also going to help increase the population with another high calorie source of food. Tomatoes were from the Americas. Squash came from there. Pineapples and tobacco. So tobacco is going to be discovered in the Americas. And by the time of the American Revolution in the late 1700s, it's going to be a huge crop. As a matter of fact, if you go back before that, the only reason that the first European colony, Jamestown, survives is because it starts growing tobacco in the early 1600s, around like 1610 or so. The growth of tobacco is what's going to give the American colonies the cash infusion to be able to survive. Cacao beans, chocolate comes from the Americas, and peanuts. Then the other side. So we already mentioned that two Americas, that is, and when we say two Americas, that means from Europe and Asia to the Americas. So you get horses that are going to come from go to the Americas from Europe. Cattle. There were no big cattle animals. The biggest domesticated animal in the Americas at this point was the llama. They did have bison in buffalo or bison in North America, but you couldn't domesticate them. They're wild animals. Sheep are going to be brought to the Americas, and pigs. One of my professors in college told me he had his doctorate in the history of Mexico, and he lived in Mexico 2 years working on his doctoral degree, and he told me that he found some writings from the Aztecs where they said that the Europeans noticed that the Aztecs really liked pig. I liked it a lot. So they asked him, why is it that you like pig so much? And the Aztecs told them, because it tastes the most like people. Yum. Bananas get brought to the Americas. You always think of banana as being kind of like something you would find in Central or South America, but they were actually from the Eastern Hemisphere. The wheat is going to be brought over, rice. So some really productive food crops are going to be brought to the Americas from Europe as well. Sugarcane, and unfortunately, especially these last two, rice and sugarcane, and tobacco as well. These are all going to become really productive crops that require a tremendous amount of labor. And sugar cane by itself is probably responsible for more deaths of slaves than any other thing in the history of mankind, any single thing. The sugarcane fields in places like Haiti, the average life expectancy for a slave there was 4 years, but slaves were so abundant that the owners didn't really care about whether or not they lived for more than 4 years because it was cheaper just to work them to death and buy another one. Coffee comes to Americas from Europe. Coffee actually originated in Africa. And diseases like smallpox. If you watch the video already, you'll know that smallpox came from the Americas, and it's going to, or to the Americas from Europe, and it's going to decimate, just absolutely wipe out. Decimate really means 1 out of every 10. It was far worse than that. In some places, 90% of the population is going to be killed by these European diseases. Europeans had been living in these filthy cities for centuries, and their bodies had gotten used to the level of nastiness that they lived in, and the immune systems of the Native Americans were just not ready to cope with that level of viral and bacterial activity, and it just wiped them out. So that by far the most Native Americans killed were not killed directly by Europeans, but by their diseases. But if it makes you feel any better, the Americas gave one disease to Europe, and that was the STD syphilis. Probably came from Native Americans and came back to Europe. All right, conquistadors. A conquistador, during the height of the Arab empires, they're actually going to take over a big part of Spain and move into France. They take over really all of Spain, and they're going to move into France. And at the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel is going to stop the advance of the Arab empires. And then over the next really almost 800 years or so, they're gradually going to push the Arabs out of Spain and reconquer Spain. So they were called reconquistadors or reconquerors, and they're going to reconquer Spain and kick all of the Arab invaders out. So the word eventually was just shortened to conquistadors or conquerors, and it just so happens around the end of the 1400s, early 1500s is when these the last of Spain was conquered, and you had generations of people that had been raised only to fight these what they were saw as Muslim invaders, and they didn't have anything to do. And so it just so happens at this time this whole new continent opens up, and these conquistadors are just looking for something else to take over, and there it is. So the first of them is Cortez, Fernando Cortez, and he is going to go in 1521 to what is modern day Mexico. Teno, I'm going to see if I can pronounce this. Tenochtitlan it is modern day Mexico City, and he goes in there to where there was like it was one of the biggest cities in the entire world. It was built in the crater of an extinct volcano. It was like Venice. It had all of these towns arranged in grids, building areas arranged in grids, and then water was between all of them, and people actually used the water as roads. Really interesting city. If you get a chance, look up a picture of this city and see if you can. You'll be amazed at just how neat it looked. So he only has 600 men, but he's able to conquer this entire empire, and it helps that he has the weapon of disease. So when he first lands, they actually think he might be a god because he's got this feathered collar thing, and they had a god who was a feathered boa. It was like a snake with feathers around his neck, and they thought maybe some historians think they maybe thought that he was like a representative from that god, and so they didn't kill him right away. They invited him back to their city. They kind of wanted to see what he was going to do. I don't think they really believed that he could conquer them. They didn't because he only had 600 men. They didn't really feel a sense of danger. But the he is going to get the Aztecs practice, as we saw in one of the other videos we watched. The Aztecs practice a lot of human sacrifice, and they did that by capturing people from surrounding tribes. And so these tribes were understandably disgruntled, angry at the Aztecs, and so he's going to actually be able to get a lot of the surrounding tribes to help him out, and they're going to attack Mexico City. The natives had never heard of a gun before, and Cortez actually had cannons, so that automatically gave him a big psychological advantage. The noise and the smoke and the sound of it was like magic for them. And then he actually is defeated. He has to leave the city, and a lot of his men are killed. And then the Aztecs eat them, a lot of them, and then these diseases just tear them up. And when Cortez gets the help of all these other natives and comes back, there's barely a fight because most of them, so many of them have been killed by these diseases. So in one sense, Cortez really got lucky. But he is going to be able to take all of the gold and treasure of this entire empire and begin sending it back across the ocean to Spain. All right, our next one is Francisco Pizarro, and he is going to conquer Cusco, what is the Incan Empire in Peru, with 200 men in 1533. So he only has 200 men, and it's another large empire. They actually they marched up to the empire, and the empire they were actually scared. He said in his account, he says that some of his men were so scared they wet their pants. Thousands after thousands after thousands of Incan warriors marched out of the city to meet them, and they had hid their cavalry with their horses and cannons and on the sides. Excuse me. And so all of these soldiers were just arrayed out in front, but they were dwarfed by the size of the Incan army. And so the Incans really didn't feel like there was much to fear of. And Atahualpa comes out there on a giant litter, like basically a bed or platform carried by like 20 slaves. And he actually comes out there to meet them. And he meets one of the Catholic priests. And the Catholic priest tries to show him a Bible, and he doesn't understand it, and he slaps the Bible out of the Catholic priest's hand, and this sparks like this wave of anger among the Spanish, and they immediately attack. Their fear is lost. They've been insulted. Now they're just mad, and they attack the Incans. The cannons that are hidden away start firing on the Incans, and it still would have been a tough battle. They had armor that the Incan and Aztec weapons were like clubs. And so they were really ineffective against Spanish armor. At the best, you got your bell rung if you got hit by one, but you weren't being killed by it. Whereas the Spanish weapons were steel, and they tended to easily pierce the leather armor that the Aztecs were using. So they also had, again, gunpowder weapons that the Incans weren't used to. And then even then, they still might have lost, even though the slaughter was just tremendous. But a bunch of the Spanish went straight to Atahualpa's litter, and they kill the servants holding it and snatch him off of it. And then the fighting stops. All right, so they take him back to the city, Cusco, and they say, "We'll let you go and we'll leave if you give us gold." He gets the biggest ransom in the history of the world, 20 tons of gold and silver, like literally a giant room filled with gold and silver, 20 tons of it. That's like um, 10 cars made of 10 cars, the volume of 10 cars made of gold. All right, so I shouldn't say the volume, the weight of 10 cars in gold. And it's so much that they almost can't even get it back. And after that, he's like, "Look, that's all the gold I have." They execute him. They go back. They lied to him and they just kill him and they take the gold. Um, One word that you might need to know that comes from Cortez and Pizarro is mestizo. That's kind of like, if you're familiar with the mulatto, which was a word that was used, we don't really hear it anymore, but it was used to describe a person of mixed European African ancestry. Mestizo is a mix of Spanish American. So the Spanish that came over, a lot of them interbred with the natives there in Central, South, and North, sorry, not Mexico, in Latin America, in South America and Central America. They're gonna breed there with the Native Americans, and their offspring are half Native American, half Spanish, and they called them mestizo. All right, last one of our big European explorers that you really got to know about is Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan is most famous because he sailed around the world. From 1519 to 1522, it was a 3-year journey, and he is going to sail completely around the world. You can see in this map the route he took. He starts from Spain, sails around the tip of South America, across the Pacific Ocean, back to Indonesia, down past Australia, and then around the tip of Africa and back up to Spain. Now, he started out with 5 ships, and by the time the voyage was over, there was only 1 ship and 18 men left. So those 18 men technically were the first to sail around the world, but it was Magellan's voyage. And even though he was killed while he was over in this area, he tried to intervene with a local conflict among some native Filipinos, and he was killed in the fighting. So he never finished the voyage. He only made it about halfway. But because one of his ships and 18 of his men completed it, that was the first time the globe had ever been circumnavigated or traveled completely around. And it definitively proves the distance of the world. There's no more continents. There are 2 continents people suspect still exist. One is Australia, and then the other one is Antarctica. So there are still 2 continents to be discovered, but that's basically most of the discovery. And Magellan is still famous. As a matter of fact, one of the first GPS systems that became really popular was called the Magellan GPS system. Samuel de Champlain is a French explorer, and he's going to found a lot of French colonies in northern North America. So if you look here, this is like modern day New York State. New York City would be like right here. He's going to sail in to the Gulf of Lawrence and discover the St. Lawrence River, and Quebec is going to be founded, which is still a very large city in France, one of the largest cities in France. And the French are going to settle here. Now, they're eventually going to be taken over by the British, and it's funny because in Quebec today, their slogan of Quebec is "We will not forget." The French there are still ticked at the Europeans because of that, and there's always talk about them wanting to leave Canada and become their own country again. All right, so he was an explorer. He was a geographer, which means he studied the geography and made maps, and he also governed colonies there in North America. People call him the father of New France. And the last one is James Cook. James Cook he's sort of the archetype explorer, the British explorer. that people base their idea of British exploration on. And you'll notice from this map that he did most of his exploring in the southern Pacific. And he's going to find Terra Australis Incognita, which was like the hidden continent of Australia. And he actually finds it. So he officially discovers Australia, discovers Antarctica. And so he's still discovering all the way until his death, during the middle of the American Revolution. And he's the last of the great explorers. There's other explorations that are going to be done, but at this point, the map of the Earth is established as far as world history is concerned. And that's it. So thanks for this 30 minutes. I hope you are all doing well. And if you have any problems, please let me know. Thanks.